right, so those are the house rules, the housekeeping items. We all know each other now, so why don't we get started? All right, so I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to bring back all three of us, and I'm going to start by posting a question. You're free to, whoever, Eric, Alex, you can answer in any order. And my first question is, when did your community management journey begin?
Yeah, so I'll start on this one. So my first sort of experience with community was from the marketing side. So sort of early in my career, I worked on marketing projects for independent films, basically film related projects, documentaries, foreign films, things without a very large budget. And so at that time, if you wanted to promote sort of indie thriller that was in Danish, you went to places where people talked about similar films and then kind of learned where to market, how to market. And so that's how I first got involved in communities and sort of niche marketing in the entertainment space. My first job as a community manager was for Reddit back in 2008. Was the 5th employee there, and yeah, ended up working at Reddit for 6 years, and so learned a lot about community from the community there. And have worked at a variety of different companies in various community and some marketing roles as well since then.
I got my start in community type things, I guess technically like back in the 90s and forums and whatever, but in the management side, I was a guild leader for a video game. And so that was my like first dabbling with how do you manage people in a space, and specifically an online space, and deal with the behaviors that come from that. And my first official community job was thanks to Eric right here. I also worked at Reddit. I think I was the 6th employee, and I joined the community team there. And that was kind of how I got my start down the deep end in community, and was there for about 5 years, and have kind of been in and out of community space, and have dipped into the product development, product management side. So now I'm at Commsor leading all of our community initiatives there, and it's been a very interesting community career.
Both of you have long and extensive journeys into this space. So this next question seems natural. Why should a company invest in the community, on a community space? And more specifically, why should a company bring in a community manager to their team?
So I think, for most, maybe not 100%, but for most companies, it's really clear that, community, and again, there's a lot of different ways to define community, but for, to keep it simple, I'll say it's when your customers, your users, your products, the people sort of, your partners, any of those groups that are important for your company are talking with each other in a many-to-many way. So using that definition, like that is, the most important thing for your company is how those groups of people talk about, the things you're doing, talk about your brand, talk about your company, talk about the broader ecosystem and industry. So, and it, touches all the different parts of the business and also includes people internally. So, at Commsor, we believe, and I personally believe, that when that's working, that's the most valuable asset a business has. So it's that sort of networked group and ecosystem of customers and all the different subgroups as well. And so and I don't know if every company, even companies that are heavily invested in community, necessarily need a community manager. That's definitely the most common, by far the most common job title and specific role. But there are companies out there that are really great at community, and there's all sorts of different roles that are focused on community. But in general, why should they invest in a team, in talented professionals who are focused specifically on the community? Just so that they can understand, so that they can grow, empower, support the community overall. And that person can really be sort of a bridge and a guide and a voice internally to connect all the different parts of the community with all the different parts of the company, and sort of keep and connect those two different worlds.
Yeah, to add on to that, it's one thing to, have a community, and it's another thing to have a community where you actually know the impact that it's having on your business, and you are able to, take advantage of that fact and build it intentionally. And you need to really have someone or a group of someones who are dedicated to thinking about that and then carrying out the strategy to make sure that it actually is benefiting your company in the way that it could and should be.
Amazing. I'm gonna hold that question from Heather. We're gonna add it, but aside from helping you with the management of the community, what are some of the most tangible contributions a community manager can make to a company?
A lot of it is honestly about cross-functional work. So you have, obviously, if you have a community where there are people externally in it, you have to manage that space and ensure that people are doing what you want them to be doing, how you want them to be doing it, in the places that you want them to do those things. But a big part of the job is really building those internal relationships as well. And so the community manager serves not only that external community, but internal as well. So understanding the needs of other teams, really taking the time to understand business strategy, and then being the point person who, if you're a team of one, I guess it falls on you to really do all of the heavy lifting there, and to understand like, hey, this is how the work that I am doing with the community can directly impact the goals or OKRs or whatever form of measurement you use internally of the marketing team, of the sales team, and whatever. And then, figuring out the long-term strategy. And so I think that it's kind of twofold, where you need to be the one responsible for building the community, growing it, making sure that it's healthy, but then also making sure that the rest of the organization actually understands what you're up to and why it's important for them and the business.
Yeah, and I think there's that you touch on something that's really key about the role of the community manager, because it's not just the external factors that matter. Is how you're going to bring that information and what you're going to do with it, and that person acts as a bit of a connector of that, all that feedback, all that really important data that you're bringing in, and then how it's going to be distributed internally. And I'll give you an example of, I work for another place where I created something really cool, which was, I traveled a lot for conferences. And one of the things I would always love to do was, whenever I travel, I would email our customers in that city and just invite them over for dinner. And it was a great way for us to bring customers, talk to them, chat, and get all this really valuable information in a no pressure way. There was no like spiel, there were no like Tupperware parties. Like it really was like, just I didn't want to eat dinner alone, so I would rather just bring in a group of people. But one of the things that I started noticing very quickly was how much information, how much valuable feedback they were giving you just by sitting next to you, and then not having somebody who would take that data and then take it inside and distribute it and be able to action on it. To me, that was a big miss of that program, because that program grew to be something really successful. And I did over like 200 customer meetups like all around the world. But it was really hard not being able to funnel all that information into the other teams, not having somebody who was in charge of that, because that was not my role really. I was doing other things, but that is one of the examples of how a community manager can really, be that person who connects and brings all that information. So you touched on something that was really, really great there. In your experience, what is the traditional career path for a community manager? Where do they even start? If somebody wants to say like, hey, I really love this journey, where do I even start?
There are a lot of different, common career paths for community managers. I'll kind of go through maybe the most common ones, but I would say the most common ones are people who are either coming from the marketing side. So, and this depends on industry as well. That's a little more common maybe in B2C world, or for DTC type companies, e-commerce. And then the other most common general path is from the support, success, experience side. Again, probably more common in the B2B world. But some of the best community managers I know have come from all kinds of different industries. Alex and I worked with an amazing community manager who previously was a CSI tech. That's about as far away from community management as one could get, but they were amazing. They had sort of personal experience dealing with fan communities and things like that. So, I think it's, and I'm sure we'll touch on this more with, probably several questions we'll get today, but, community teams as a example, community teams sit under different parts of the organization. They could sit under marketing, they could sit under support, product, R&D, sales, operations. They could be its own team like we have at Commsor. And I think you also see that evidenced in career paths. So sometimes people come in from marketing, sometimes support, sometimes sales. Sometimes they come in from the customer side. I know a lot, again, more common in B2C, but sometimes in B2B as well, where you see someone who's just a really great, they're a customer, they're a user, they get really involved, and then they sort of cross the aisle, so to speak, and become a community manager. See that happen all the time. So there's no one or even, two or three most common paths. And maybe as the industry matures, over the next decade or two, some of that, some of those paths solidify a little bit, but in general, because community touches all the different parts of the organization by design, and cuts across those traditional silos by design, I think we'll always see a variety of different ways to enter into the community profession. And I think that's one of it does make it confusing sometimes, and can make it challenging to especially if you're hiring or managing or figuring out your own career path. But I definitely think that big aspect is a strength overall.
Yeah, one of the beauties is that it doesn't necessarily matter where you're coming from, like career-wise, but there are a lot of overlaps in kind of like skill sets and attributes for people who make good community managers. And I think that that's one of the important things to keep in mind, especially, for anyone who is in the audience now thinking about hiring community people and taking a flyer on someone who does have kind of that non-traditional path where they haven't necessarily done community before, but they still have relevant experience and skills.
Speaking of that, what are some of the top skill sets that you look for when thinking of a community manager? What are some of those like transferable skills, or what are some of the developmental skills that you can bring in as a community manager?
I'll give my like top 2 or 3, and then Eric, if you want to take it. I think to be a community manager, you really need to have good problem solving skills, and like be creative about it too, because it's an inherently human job. Like, you are dealing with people, and people are going to do what people are going to do. And so understanding that you're going to see a lot of weird situations, no matter what community or company you are working for, and have to like figure out interesting ways to solve that. And also interesting ways to like figure out how to prevent things from happening too. So I think like problem solving and creativity are big there. And it probably helps to also have like project management or program management skills, being very on top of moving pieces, because oftentimes there are lots of different initiatives or programs or events or whatever that you are having to juggle on a daily basis. And so being able to be like ruthless in your schedule and prioritization and project management is really important too.
Absolutely. I agree with those. And I think a theme you that I heard with some of those answers, and I see as well, that's maybe hard to describe, is that ability to think on multiple levels at the same time. So that ability to abstractly, that ability to think, sort of in different timelines, is I think what separates really good community managers from just, good community managers. So meaning that like you are representing the community, the group, the network group of customers or prospects or users or whatever. You're also representing the company. And you're having to think about things both on an individual and a group dynamic level, and on both a short and long-term level. And especially if you're involved in, a startup or an emerging product line or a new product or a new space, you have to take that into consideration as well. So you kind of have to think on those levels at the same time, which is super interesting and makes it definitely not a boring job, but it can be challenging to do. I think that's a skill set and an approach that definitely you can get better at over time, but also have to have some hard skills there. In terms of more the types of skills that sort of recruiters and people look for, I work with a lot of hiring managers and see a lot of work with a lot of candidates as well. And in talking to them, and also we did a report that'll be coming out next month around community careers, where we actually analyzed 100 job descriptions and talked to 60 people who are community professionals and basically asked them this question. We saw a few repeating patterns in terms of hard and soft skills, and I won't get into the full details, but one that came up a lot, and I think you'll see in articles, Twitter threads, and whatever, is empathy. And I think that term gets, what people mean when they say empathy. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. But I think just the ability to kind of see, look at those different aspects from the perspective of the different people inside your community and from the different people internally. So being able to, as that connector, as that person who's triaging and bridging and connecting dots for the company and the community, being able to look at issues, problems, opportunities from the lens of the product team, from the lens of a customer who's really frustrated, from the lens of someone new who's coming into this and doesn't really know much about, whatever the sort of industry or the world that your community is operating in. That's, I think, a really important skill, and I think that's kind of what people mean when they say empathy. But obviously, that's a complex skill there. And then, I think just general, Alex mentioned this too, but just general business sense and just general understanding, and that, I think a lot of that is built up with just curiosity. And I think that's a really important skill for community people in general, just being curious, wanting to know, again, internally and externally, what's going on, what are the different departments in a company excited about, what are the different types of groups and subgroups in our community excited about, what are they worried about, what's going on in their professional, personal worlds. I just think that type of curiosity can really help day-to-day work, but also help, bridge any of those, fill in any of those gaps around general business understanding, because, none of us are fully versed in all the different aspects of any business, even if we've been there for a while. So just being curious can really help you, need to know to be effective at your job.
Amazing. We have a couple questions, and I don't want to let them pile up. So I have a question for Heather. We're going to talk about the future and the state of the industry. So I'm saving your question for that, Heather. Don't worry, I'm not forgetting. Doug, you also asked a question, but I'm going to go to this one from Becky. It says, our team is currently transitioning from having the role of customer success managers to community success managers. What advice would you have for our team as we transition from the one-on-one to the one-to-many relationship?
So for me personally, and Eric, I'll be curious if you've seen something different, but I don't know that it's necessarily transition away from or to. I think it's an addition. So I think that, customer success managers, community success people are they serve similar but different purposes, at least in my experience. And I think that as companies create that role, they should be working together really, really closely and be very aligned on obviously like messaging and the relationships and communication and all of that good stuff. But I think that there's like a very uniquely different approach when it comes to being a community success versus a customer success person. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but that's kind of where my brain goes.
Yeah, I would say just, I think the biggest difference is you have a wider range of tools that you can take advantage of as a community manager, but also that you have to be aware of. Maybe tools isn't the right word, mediums and types of communication. So one that's really important when you're dealing with many to many, that obviously is important when you're just doing one-to-one as a CSM or as in support is making sure that your message can, easily be relayed from the one person you're talking to, their team, to their peers, to their friend that works at a different company. And so in community work, that becomes even more important. Sometimes you're talking with people one-to-one in a similar way. Sometimes you're talking to large groups by posting something in your own community or in an outside community. Sometimes it's a community member sort of repeating something on your behalf, maybe in the way you want them to, and maybe not. But just being aware of those different communication tools, I think is important. And I would say you also then have the ability to sort of hopefully analyze and sort of study those different mediums and sort of communication patterns as well. But I think the basic building blocks are pretty similar.
Amazing. Thank you, Vicky, for that question. We talked about the skill sets, but what are some of the challenges that community managers face on day to day? So, we know what can be fixed, but what are some of the things that they face and that they will need to be aware of as a community manager?
I'll start with this one. I talked earlier about those different levels and needing to think at sort of a meta level and a long-term level and a short-term level, and jumping back and forth between all those is hard. I struggle with it. It's very similar to a challenge that a lot of community managers, especially in small teams or teams of one, face to, which is jumping back and forth between sort of strategic planning and being an individual contributor actually responding. So, 1 minute, especially since a lot of communities are on, synchronous, more real-time things like Slack or Discord or whatever, you need to respond to people in, or they're expecting a response in 5 or 10 minutes or even less sometimes. And then you may have to jump back to thinking about, okay, what are we doing over the next 3 months? And then you may need to think about this new group that's coming into the community because the product or service sort of expanded versus the people that have been there for a long time. So, dealing with all these different sort of groups and levels and personas, I think, again, is exciting and dynamic, but it's also challenging and can be hard. And as a community manager, there's no end of the to-do list. It's an infinite scroll. There's always someone you can message. There's always someone you can follow up on. There's always a question you can chime in on. So just being able to prioritize, I think, is an endless challenge, and something, even those of us that are good at it, which I'm not, but those of us that are, who've been in the profession for a long time, still are struggle with and try, because it really is. There's no point where you're like, great, I've done everything I can.
Yeah, Eric, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the top 2 things that I think are biggest problems are prioritization, because you're going to have programs. You're going to have maybe like 5 programs that you're running, and all of them are happening concurrently. And so understanding like what you should be doing while you also have to have those active conversations. And then as part of that, many community folks are responsible for like 5 different roles kind of rolled into one. And so with that context switching, with prioritization, like you may have a really difficult time understanding what the purpose of your role is and what you really should be focusing on. And I think part of this is also that a lot of community folks, many, maybe not a lot, many have been in other roles within their organizations or within other companies and have kind of been foisted into the role of community manager without necessarily asking for it or it being intentional. It just kind of happens to them. And so there isn't necessarily a lot of structure or understanding around what the role and responsibilities are. And that can be really difficult for a number of folks, especially if you are, building the strategy, doing the individual contributor work, trying to like juggle a totally new frame of mind, and then also having to manage tons of different personas within a community, and all of them may have slightly different needs and problems that you're trying to solve. So like there's a lot of things that you end up juggling one way or another, regardless of the community or the company that you're working for.
Amazing. Okay, so we talk about the skill sets, some of the challenges. We talk about the present. Community is definitely something that's growing. So the only natural way to think about the future of community is like more, and we hopefully see more and more industries adopt community as part of their digital marketing, as part of their strategies. Heather asked, do you see the future of work, especially within the community industry, moving towards a higher focus on contracting / outsourcing?
This is an interesting question. And I've kind of seen, I don't know that I have a like solid 100% answer for you here, just kind of what I've been seeing. So there are definitely more companies that I've spoken with or have reached out who have asked about this as a concept. And it's been framed not necessarily as a, hey, we are absolutely looking to do this or interested in doing this, but more of a conceptual question of like, hey, is this even a possibility? Does this remotely make sense? But at the same time, I think that we're starting to really see that, people aren't necessarily as interested in being part of huge, gigantic communities. Micro communities are like a thing that's on the rise. People are super burnt out just from like existing and finding small groups of people that they care about, especially when it's geared around a brand or a product or whatever, to share those experiences and community vibes is like what I'm seeing a lot of. And so I think that by outsourcing this type of community work, it's difficult to do when you have those smaller communities. And I think it's especially difficult to do if the goal is to like really build community-led organizations where the community ties back to the rest of the organization, like everyone is bought in. And so if you've kind of outsourced a lot of the work, you're removing a lot of the direct relationship building internally between the community team and the rest of the organization. And so I think it makes it difficult. And so I don't know is kind of my answer here, but that's my personal opinion and thoughts on like where things could go and why I kind of hope it doesn't go that way. Eric, have you seen anything different?
No, in general, I don't. And Heather, I'm not sure if you the intent of your question in terms of like short term or really long term. But in general, I think maybe for larger communities or platforms or sort of communities that require a lot of moderation, I could definitely see some skilled contractors and outsourcing there. I also think in something Alex had made me think about this too. For those sort of micro communities, I think there might be more possibilities or options for people that are somewhere between a community member and an employee, right? So compensating I think there'll be more ways to compensate members of the community, not just for their contributions, but for taking on that sort of meta role as a facilitator or the leader of a space. And some communities already do this. Some of the excitement around Web3, that there's sort of more tools for people to do that. But I could absolutely see, if let's say Commsor, for example, we run a community for community managers, community club, which hopefully many of you are in, and maybe we start to notice there's a really large group of community managers that are in healthcare, and in healthcare there's just different stuff they have to deal with than maybe what our existing team has a background in. So maybe we find a way to compensate someone who can serve as the sort of leader or the ambassador or facilitator or mod or whatever you want to call it of that subgroup that has domain expertise and is willing and able to take on a certain amount of responsibility and deserves to be compensated for that. So I could see that happening, especially as companies, as the communities that companies either support or facilitate get into different specialized areas. There becomes a point where it doesn't make sense for the company to also have like deep subject matter expertise in all of those areas, but the community does. So there needs to be some way to compensate for that. So I could see that happening. I also could see, I don't know, it's interesting, a lot of long-term, there's a lot of like sort of HR functions that traditionally large companies used to take responsibility for, but now they're outsourcing those. Not because of capacity or ability, as much as the employees wouldn't trust the company to do those things anymore. And so I could also see a category, this probably isn't what you meant, but it just made me think of it. It's interesting to think about, especially for communities. Could companies bring in third parties that are accountable and independent, and maybe indirect or not indirectly, but are compensated by the company, but are independent and credible enough and have their own reputation, where they can be not just perceived but function more independently than if they were full-time employees, and really be somewhere between serving the company and the community as an entity, as a space. So I could see that happening in some places down the road, and it would be interesting, sort of a ombudsman type thing, but for the community space and truly independent. Again, a lot of HR type things happening these days.
Yeah, and I think you've uncovered a really interesting topic conversation for a future webinar, which is like the different roles within a community. And I think that's a good problem to have as communities grow, is like how you start involving your members in a more active way and how you start growing within, because I mean, it's a good problem to have. The company or a community grows to a point where like a community manager can no longer just manage everything. And that's where you start looking at some of your more active members, like those ambassadors that are going to be there for you, and start like empowering up a little bit more, so that it really feels like a many-to-many space where like you're using and really benefiting from that meaningful interactions and deep interactions from your top members. So that's a topic for another time. All right. Okay, so let's assume, like, let's go with the idea that, okay, I'm sold. I think I'm going to bring a community manager. There's a really great thing for my business. That's not enough. What are some of the tools that somebody like a company should think of, or some of the resources community managers have available to help them with the success of implementing and growing community?
I feel like this is a loaded question because there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this. I think the big question that any company or community professional should be asking themselves is like, what's the purpose of our community? Who are the people we're trying to solve? What are their problems? And how do we want them to interact? And that's kind of the way that I generally approach understanding, like, all right, what tools do we actually need? Because it's less important about what platforms you're using than about how are you creating these connections and relationships and like building the space where the community that you want to exist can exist. So I think there's a lot of different owned community spaces. I guess that's something that I would also recommend for pretty much any company that's pursuing building a community intentionally, is like, you should own the space. There are certainly ways that you can get away with like having your community on Reddit or on different platforms like that, but spin up a Discord server or spin up a Slack workspace, or find a forum tool. It's all about how you want the communication to go down and to be accessible. And so those are like, that's my non-answer to this, is that there's a lot of different things that you could pursue, but you need to answer those questions before you can really start going down any of those paths for what tools you use.
Great. Alex, you're in a role that's not so traditional to see in a company, which is community officer, which I'm really happy. What was the journey of and Eric, I ask you the same question, like, what is the journey of growing and climbing the corporate ladder when you really want to be community be the focus of your work, of your career? What are some of the steps that you can take to get there?
I would say, what was most helpful for me, and actually, let me back up for a second. So a lot of what happened in my career to help me get here was partly being at the right place at the right time, but also really advocating for myself. And I credit Erik and Reddit hugely with my ability to kind of pursue community professionally, just because it really opened my mind to a lot of possibilities within the community space and different areas that were interesting and all of that, and helped me understand in myself, like, where am I lacking? Where are there gaps? Because I know that I can, have conversations with a bunch of people on different topics and juggle projects and whatever. But, I recognized that really being intentional about that project management, product development, all of those skills was really important. And so that's kind of why I made the pivot. And I think that you can pivot into a lot of different spaces, or you can come from those spaces into community because of the shared skill sets. But what was most helpful for me career-wise was making that move into product, because it helped me understand business. It helped me really understand, how do you take this stuff that I was doing unintentionally as a community manager and putting structure and a framework around it, and then understanding, hey, this doesn't have to be data driven, but data augmented, and understanding, how people are interacting with a product or a community, how this actually ties back to revenue, how you iterate, how you form things, and, treat it as an experiment or treat it like feature development, stuff like that. And so as I was then trying to figure out what I was doing next in my career, because I got tired of product, I was like, all of these skills that I have learned now can take me back into community. And so that's kind of how I wanted to get back in, and landed at a startup was, hey, this is all the stuff I'm interested in. I'm curious. I've learned all of these business things. Now I can apply the community stuff that I'm really passionate about to a business and help them figure out like how we do all of this from the ground up. And so that's kind of my meandering community career, where it was really all about just like getting different skills and getting insights into different industries and businesses and companies at different stages, because I ended up working like at super tiny startups. And then I ended up working at Nike with whatever, like 100,000 people, and understanding the nuances of what those relationships at a business that size is. So that's my rambling answer for all of this, but I thought it was really helpful and learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, totally. We have two questions that we haven't addressed. One of them, Melissa's question, this is actually a topic we're going to discuss in our next community conversations, which is engagement and growth strategies. But I'm gonna pose it to both of you, and then we're gonna go to the last question. This is a long one. What are some ways to help grow the community as a community manager? How can we bring more members into the community? We're just starting our community platform and we're wanting to grow our member base organically. We have several social media and email campaigns, but we are in a tricky industry, cannabis. So are there any tips on growing the community while working in a space that isn't always the easiest to advertise in?
Great question. One of the things I have learned working in community time and time again is the community is much smarter than I am, and the community is much smarter than anyone or any small group of people. And so I would say I don't know what the answer is in your case, but I'm pretty sure your community, even if it's already pretty small, does. And so one is at the early stage of just have one-to-one and conversations and invite people personally. Just the same way if you were trying to throw a really big house party, you try to get that sort of critical mass there, and then eventually there's a party that's going to be happening, and then that brings in that sort of second circle of people. But I've always learned a lot from the as a marketer. I've always learned a lot by how people actually come into the community. So I always try to ask, even today, like when I talk with someone who's sort of in the Commsor and community club community, I always ask them, how did you first find out? And it's usually not straightforward. It's usually I heard about it and then I joined the mailing list and then someone told me about this, or I was searching for this and I found this sort of entry point and then something else happened. And that's true of a lot of different things. There's always sort of multi-touch, but I think especially for community. And so I always try to learn, like, what was it that actually got them to join? What was their first point of contact? And then especially what was the pitch, right? If a friend told them about it, what did they say? If they saw something online on social media, on an ad or whatever, what was it that made them, they have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of things they could do with their time. What was it that really made them click through or remember to punch it in on the phone while they're waiting for the bus? And just, continuously trying to learn from that and then folding those insights back into your emails, your marketing, and just setting up. And then once you get to a certain, size, setting up a feedback loop so you can constantly keep asking. I also love seeing, searching and seeing how do people talk about the community organically. So looking at social media, looking at posts, whatever, what do people say? How do they frame it? How do they position it? When they talk sort of on social or to a friend. So I think the answer is somewhere in the community itself.
And I think there's for this particular question, I think there's an opportunity to focus on education. She's in an industry that there's had a lot of controversy around, cannabis, what it is, what it isn't. And I think as you're trying to build a community, part of it is like educating the audience into what your business is and what it is not, what your community is and what it is not, because I'm personally not a cannabis consumer. So, I have my own set of assumptions of what these industries are that I may be completely wrong about. And I think part of that effort of growing this organically is focusing on the education point of like, what are these businesses doing for the overall, like, what are some of the benefits? What are some of the things that are working well, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I don't know, but my first thought is like, I think there's an opportunity here for education to grow the engagements that you're bringing into your community. All right.
And then, sorry, one thing I've got to add is that just asking your community members to, asking for them to tell people, asking the existing community members to invite people that they know or to post about it. I just think that's key. And giving them sort of prompts and excuses. Hey, we have an awesome event coming up, or we just added this thing. If you know anyone who could benefit from this discussion, we just added a channel or a group or a whatever post about XYZ, people who want to work in the industry, or I don't know. If you know someone that would could help answer this type of question, I think directly asking your existing members, if you can be, the more specific you can be, the more effective that is. And a lot of times they'll be excited to help.
All right, I want to be super mindful of time. We have one last question, and it's one that I actually like asking anyone I ever had the privilege of interviewing is, what would you, if you could go back in time to the beginning of your career journey, today we're talking about careers, like what would you tell yourself? And I think this ties with Doug's questions, like what do you wish you knew on your first day at Reddit? So whoever wants to answer, keep it short so that we can wrap up hopefully by the hour.
I think mine would be like, the world isn't going to end if you don't immediately reply to something. And I think this is a big one for a lot of community folks to just, especially if you work for a company that has a community that is incredibly active and is active 24/7, and it's like conversational and moves fast. You're not like, even if you're on 100%, you are never going to be able to stay on top of everything. And you just have to create systems that help you deal with that fact. And so I wish I had known that going into Reddit. And I wish that I had known that just in general in my career. Yeah.
Yeah. So same thing. Put your mask on first. If you don't take care of yourself physically, whatever, emotionally, like you can't help the community you're trying to help. And it's hard because community managers in general, we care, we give a shit, we really want to help people. But if you're burned out and miserable and tired and whatever, like you're not going to be able to help. So take care of yourself. It can be a demanding job, which is a good thing. It's why we like it. But you can definitely get burned out, and yeah, it can have a real impact, and that's not good for your community long term. So take care of yourselves.
Amazing. Mine is ask questions. Always ask. I wish I asked a lot more questions than I did. Shame, fear, whatever, imposter syndrome. But people are always willing to help. You just have to ask, and that's something I've learned in many years. Okay, we're gonna try to wrap this. I want to start. I want to finish by saying thank you to Erik and Alex, Angels, for being here with us today. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen just to wrap up this quickly. All right, so. This is the first of this event's community conversations. We'd love to hear your feedback. You're going to receive a survey in an email. Please let us know what you think, what we did well, what we can improve, what you'd like to see, what you want to discuss in the next events. All that will be available in the survey. So please help us by filling it out. Join our Campfire community. I'm also going to send you links to some amazing resources that our friends at Commsor made available. There's a couple of ebooks. There's a couple of websites that I'm going to send to you. So all that will be in an email that's going to go out on Friday. And next, mark your calendar. Their next community conversations is July 20th. We have 2 great confirmed speakers. We're going to talk about engagement tools and community growth. And we have Anna Gregorian from Community Weekly and Pablo Gonzalez from B2B Community Builder podcast. They both confirmed, and I'm super stoked for that conversation. More info to come soon to you. But with that, I wish everyone a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, wherever you're in the world. Again, Alex, Erik, thank you for being part of this. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, everybody.